Most of you know, feels silly saying this, most of you know there's a banner that hangs outside the front of our church. If you're joining us online and you have not visited our building or seen a photo, the banner says things like refugees are welcome, Black Lives Matter, love is love, LGBTQ+, women can lead, protect the earth, etc. It's pretty large, so it can be seen from the street, and the wind kind of plays havoc with it. And so we've had to replace it a few times. The first version we put up several years ago had a hashtag at the bottom, and it said, "Our Family Values." So I mention this because one day when I was working in the office, someone rang our office entrance doorbell. And we have a camera and a microphone upstairs or in the office, and so I was able to look out and I didn't recognize the person, so I said, "May I help you?" And someone says, not in a very friendly tone, "I need to talk to someone about your family values." So there were two staff people there with me, Patty and Brandon, but just the three of us, so it was clearly my job to go downstairs and talk to the guy at the door. And so I alerted Patty and Brandon to what had been said and that I was going downstairs. And I don't remember everything that he said to me, but he challenged the statements on our banner. And he quoted Bible verses, and he asked me if I believed in the Bible. And I said, I think something like, "Well, yes, but I probably read the Bible a little differently than you do," which did not impress him very much. And I don't really think that he would have become violent, but his demeanor was kind of threatening. I think he really felt like he needed to school me. And so Patty had come down and she sat at that little desk back there, kind of pretended to work. And Brandon walked through the entryway behind me a couple times because we're just standing in the doorway talking. I didn't let him in. And they had my back, but it was definitely not a productive conversation. And I finally just ended it basically saying, we obviously have different views and we're not really getting anywhere. So I think, you should probably go. So on the other hand, as Maureen said, this conversation between Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well was very productive. And it's a long, you did a great job. It's pretty much 42 verses. But she got the high points, and I may get to cut some of my stuff out because I only expected her to do like the first 14 verses. I was trying to keep it short for her. So, good job. It is the longest conversation that Jesus has with anyone in all of the Gospels that we know of. And it's striking in a number of ways, as Maureen said. Most Jews at the time wouldn't even travel through Samaria. They would go well out of their way to avoid that. And if they did, a Jewish man would likely not have been talking to a Samaritan woman in the way that they were talking. But they treat each other with respect in spite of their religious and political differences. They'd been enemies for centuries, but Jesus obviously considered her a worthy conversation partner. And so at one point, Jesus asked her to leave and return with her husband. And she says, "I have no husband." And Jesus says, "That's true, you've had 5 husbands, and the person you're with right now is not your husband." And this piece of it has resulted in a portrayal of this woman as having an immoral lifestyle for, probably centuries. But if you notice, Jesus, who's not usually shy about telling people to change their ways, change their life, he offers no call to repentance, no word of judgment. And we don't really know about her life. Maybe her life story was more tragic than scandalous. I'm betting one at least of those 5 husbands died. And there was a system in place to take care of widows in that society. Clearly, that system had failed this woman. So maybe her life was just filled with rejection, with loss piled upon loss. Maybe she's resigned herself to a lonely, isolated existence with someone who really doesn't care for her. But Jesus sees her true self and treats her with compassion and respect. And what's not really clear, unless you know Greek or unless you read about it, which is what I have to do, I don't know Greek, but Jesus' response to her when he says, "That's true," is the word kalos. And kalos is generally translated as true. But it's not just, yeah, that's a true statement. And the real definition of kalos is beautiful by reason of purity of heart and life, and hence praiseworthy. These restorative words, offered in response to her vulnerability and her honesty, may just be for her the living water that Jesus was speaking of. And in that moment, her eyes are opened, and she sees him for who he is, recognizes, she says, "I see you are a prophet." And then what follows is this deep conversation that Maureen told us about the coming of the Messiah, about the best place to worship, because that was one of the big conflicts between the Jews and the Samaritans. Should you worship in Jerusalem or on Mount Gerizim? So he answers her question about that. And then for the first time to anyone, he reveals to her that he is the Messiah. Think about what an honor that is for her. So at the end of their conversation, I meant to bring a Bible up with me. She says, and Maureen included some of this, "I know that the Messiah is coming, who is called the Christ. When he comes, he will proclaim all things to us." This is when Jesus said, "I am he, the one who is speaking to you." So she does then leave her jug behind, trying to figure out what I can skip. She leaves her jug behind. She goes, she tells the people in town, this man has just told her everything she's ever done. And this is another indication, I think, that she was probably more highly regarded than she gets credit for. People talk about how the townspeople shunned her. I'm not so sure, because they listened to her. And they came, they met Jesus. They all invited him to stay in town for a couple of days, had their own conversations, and they came to believe in Jesus as well. And so this unnamed woman gets credit for being a disciple and a great evangelist. So how is it that a woman considered to be Jesus' enemy becomes a disciple and a great evangelist? Part of the purpose of this story is to explain the existence of Samaritans in the Christian communities at the time that it was written, to show that Jesus bridged their differences, that if you recall in John 3:16, it says, "God so loved the world," that the Samaritans were part of that world and included in God's family. It also fits with the gospel writer's larger agenda, which is clearly stated in the 20th chapter, which is to persuade his readers that Jesus was indeed the Messiah and that belief in him leads to eternal life. On a more personal level, it's a great model for how to accept people's differences, to talk to our so-called enemies. So when I think back to our visitor at the door that day, we entered into that conversation with pretty severe preconceived notions of one another. I was certainly on the defensive just because of what he had said before I went downstairs, which I perceived as a challenge. He was pretty surprised to realize that I, a woman, was a pastor, so that didn't help either one of us. We were both pretty entrenched in our positions. And while I wasn't argumentative, I'm sure I could have asked him more questions, just like Jesus and the Samaritan woman did, showed more of an openness to him as a person, if not to his ideas. I certainly also then didn't perceive that he was willing to listen to me, but I could have possibly been wrong. You probably know that there are many organizations that are trying to help people learn how to cross boundaries and have meaningful, life-changing conversations. Among a few, the Dialogue Institute invites people to share Muslim, Christian, and Jewish viewpoints. We've hosted some of those conversations here. The Civil Conversations Project tries to, quote, change the narrative that America tells itself about race. American public media hosts these public conversations on different topics sometimes. And a few years ago, I attended a conversation at the Central Resource Library hosted by KCUR, the local NPR affiliate. And I know there were a few other St. Andrew people there, so some of you might remember this. But they had invited Jean Peters Baker, the Jackson County prosecutor, who's a Democrat, and Kevin Yoder, a Republican, who at the time was the U.S. House Rep for Kansas's 3rd District. And they were invited there to have a conversation with each other, and I would say there were maybe about 100 people in the audience there to listen to this conversation. And so they had some questions that they each responded to, and I remember that they found some common ground in that they both grew up on a farm, and I think they probably gained some understanding of each other as they shared how they had come to the political views that they now hold. And one thing that I really liked is they gave all of us who attended a conversation deck, which they probably used to structure this conversation. So it had 4 or 5 cards that have tips on how to set up a conversation between people that have differing views or values. And then they have 8 cards that have actual questions that you can ask each other. So one is, how did you come to the political views that you have? What are the values that are most important to you? They're mostly were all targeted, they're political questions, or they have something to do with political views. And how did you get to where you are? Are there any political views you have that are a conflict with you? Lots of questions like that. So it's definitely a political thing. But it occurs to me that some kind of setup like that, and maybe some different questions, it wouldn't have to be so political, could be helpful, especially maybe in some of our racial justice work and conversations that we're trying to set up. So I thought this sermon was going to be about crossing boundaries like Jesus did, to have holy conversations with people we might rather avoid like Jesus did, and through those holy conversations develop relationships that would bring healing and wholeness, God's living water, to our world. I could have just said that, because that is what it's about. But if you watched my sermon intro video that goes out, you know that I've also been thinking a lot about enemies. Because if Jesus and the Samaritan woman were enemies, I think it's fair to say that at least from our vantage point, looking at them, they were probably much more alike than different. So I've been thinking, well, what is it that makes an enemy? The dictionary says, it's a person who is actively opposed or hostile to someone or something. Or it's a thing that harms or weakens something else. So I think we can easily think of people or things that might fall into those categories. Obviously, some of us have actual personal experiences with folks who have threatened us, so there's that. But it's not hard to think of groups or individuals in the political sphere maybe right now who might qualify. Or we could identify things like white supremacy or most of the isms, racism, sexism, homophobia, etc., as enemies to persons and to a way of life that we aspire to or we want to protect. Part of the reason also, besides the scripture, that this has been on my mind is that I ran across this book. It's called How to Have an Enemy. And it's written by Melissa Florer-Bixler. She's a Mennonite pastor. And the title caught my attention because I thought, wait, shouldn't it be How to Not Have an Enemy? Because I thought, how to be nice, polite Christians and love our enemies? The implication or the admission that we have enemies and that there was a how-to book about having them somehow made me uncomfortable when I first read it. And I'm not sure why it didn't occur to me that if the Bible tells us to love our enemies, the clear assumption is that we have enemies. The subtitle, though, is Righteous Anger and the Work of Peace. Now that seemed right up my alley. It's very justice-y, So I've read the book once, and I've reviewed it as I worked on this sermon, and I still feel like I need to reread it to let it sink in. So I'm just going to share a little bit of it for all of us to think about so that you can be as confused as me, maybe. I don't know. Florer-Bixler uses the word enemy to describe a relationship between people, one that recognizes how a person uses their power, actively or passively, to harm or dominate others. With enemies, she says, one is either in power over the other, or there's a conflict over who holds power. She does point out that power is not necessarily bad, and we know it's a misuse or abuse of power that causes problems. But she says people misconstrue who our enemies really are. We let conflict and difference turn into active hostility, and then we lose the ability to understand the real issues that are at play. So as an example, she says Christian nationalists have a fear of losing power and control. So they've got this religious power kind of intertwined with white supremacist power. But they portray that fear as harm. So for instance, when a Christian prayer in school is replaced with a moment of silence, their supposed harm, which is really discomfort over the removal of the prayer, is not in any way equivalent to the real harm experienced by Black people at the hands of Christian nationalists and white supremacy. So I think her point is that Christian nationalists have confused or conflated the fear of losing power with the fear of being harmed. And I wonder if we may run into the same risk in the work of peacemaking if we don't understand the fears of those we hope to find some common ground with. As followers of Christ, we are called, she says, to identify, name, and confront power structures that harm others. Our differences with our enemies are real, and our anger over the harm caused to marginalized people is righteous. But if our first instinct is to assume everyone different from us is our enemy, we're just going to end up in this suspicious, fearful place. If we seek to understand the motivations and fears of those who are different from us, we may be able to create a space to discover commonalities and shared expectations that can be the basis of something new. So, I've got to keep reading and pondering and dreaming and thinking about this. Because I don't know if we ever get these kinds of questions completely figured out. And maybe that in itself is the real work of peacemaking. The woman at the well had an encounter with Jesus, and something in her began to grow. Her faith wasn't full, it was just beginning, but she shared her story with others to the extent that she could, and she invited them to come and see for themselves. Something they saw in her called them into their own transformation. So this week I was listening to listening to an interview with Diana Butler Bass. She's an author, a progressive Christian, and a historian of Christianity. And she was asked, what is the best defense against Christian nationalism? And first she said she'd already been asked that question 3 times that week. But her best response of the 3 was this: tell people their lives are the best defense. If you're a Christian, and if you're a person who is moving towards justice, and if that's the way you understand the Christian story, then you are the best defense against Christian nationalism. Because your life gives people hope that there's a different way of being a Christian in this world. Any conversation can be holy, especially when it comes from a place of vulnerability and courage, from a willingness to be open to others and to entertain questions. Holy conversations apparently require a desire to understand the fears and motivations of others and to have a lack of defensiveness. Seems like kind of a tall order, maybe. But if we can ignite our own and each other's imaginations to believe that understanding and transformation is possible, then maybe we can truly become water bearers to the world. Amen.